Hello, we're Soul Margin Fishing and Conservation Foundation, and welcome to our channel. Come join us here every Sunday for Soul Sunday, where we release new videos. Please donate to our cause and subscribe now. Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar tonight. If this is your first time being here, welcome to a Soul Margin Fishing and Conservation Foundation webinar. I'm Captain Sam Baker. I'm your host tonight, and I have a special person with me tonight. But before that, I want to let you know about something. We're going to have a Q&A section at the end of this webinar. So if you're watching on our website, if you look at the bottom, there's a QA section, right? If you have questions that come up while you're watching this webinar, please put them in that QR section, right? So we can answer them at the end of the webinar if possible. As well, if you're watching on Facebook Live as well, you want to do the same thing, just put it in the comments and we'll get to that. So let me introduce the speaker. His name is Mr. Michael Sipos, right? And he is a Florida Sea Grant agent from South Florida. He has his undergrad in zoology, and he also got his grad degree, which is, he got it in, make sure I say this right, Fisheries and Aquatic Science from the University of Florida. He did research with groupers and the barotromics, that he'll go over that a little bit, I think, but that's basically when you see a fish with their tongue hanging out or that type of research, or the belly out of the stomach, that's what that means. He can go in more detail about that. He also helped with the Deep Water Horizon oil spill, doing research on how that affects the fisheries, as well as how offshore dredging affect the Cape Canaveral area. He loves to discover. He loves finding invasive species and catching them, everything from fish, iguanas to pythons. And then he loves to fish as well. And he's an amazing spear fisherman. He sent me some really cool photos as well. So Mike is here. I'm gonna let him talk a little bit and take over. But everybody, here's Mr. Mike. And so, hey Mike, man, good to see you, to have you here, to take your time out to do a webinar with us. I know we chatted about this a few times, but super excited to have you here. So I'm gonna let you take over, and you can start sharing your screen. So go ahead, Michael.
Sure. Thanks, Captain. Yep. My name's Mike Sipos. I'm the Collier County Sea Grant agent here at the Extension Office down in Naples area. So a little bit of more information about myself. I did my background in zoology. I was a weird lizard kid growing up, had plenty of snakes, reptiles, amphibians, and then I did my master's on hormonal induction spawning of ornamental fish. So those are two big culprits that you might see as invasive species in our area, whether that is, some sort of reptile running around, or a non-native fish like a lionfish, a Mayan cichlid, an oscar. But invasive species can be a lot of different kind of organisms, and there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. As an extension agent here in Southwest Florida and dealing with marine resources, the number one cold call received question I get as an agent is, what is this in my backyard? Should it be here? Oftentimes it's about cane toads. So in this seminar, we're going to go over terminology, sort of how and why they're so prevalent in our area in Florida, just as a state, management costs, environmental sort of costs, why, some profiles of some scaly invaders, and then steps of what you can do. So like I mentioned, these aren't just plants or animals, but they can be fungi, bacteria, insects, crustaceans, mollusks, birds, all sorts of stuff. And a lot of the critters that we see now, we might not even consider invasive species anymore, but they came from someplace else and it might be impacting us to a high degree, like the Norwegian rat. You might see a rat outside and think, oh, it's just a rat, but that one might have been an invasive species that came over hundreds of years ago. Same thing with the German roach, European starlings, Asian carp, emerald ash borers, feral swine. A lot of those kind of critters that you might just think are native in the area, but they aren't from here. So, what is an invasive species? I did talk to a lot of different groups, whether it's a fishing club, HOA, school group. But a lot of folks might not know what an invasive species is, so we want to get the terminology right because you might have heard words like non-native, which is good, foreign, uh, non-indigenous, alien, exotic, invasive, exotic, and some of those sound cool, like exotic, and some of them, like alien or non-indigenous, might sound bad, but they might be describing the same kind of organism. So, an invasive species is a species that is non-native and it occurs outside of a specific geographic area and it was introduced by humans intentionally or unintentionally. So that introduction by humans is a big one because if they came here naturally, whether it got blown in by a storm, floated over by something, if that wasn't caused by humans, that's just probably a native species in our area. And then the big thing right here is it has to or has the potential to cause harm to the environment, economy, or humans. So whenever you see this picture here, you might see this little raccoon, right? He can create a mess in your backyard that can be, economic harm. This alligator here could be, potential human harm if he's in their backyard. But this cat, this is actually the only non-native species in Florida on this slide. And you can see that with a bird in its mouth. So a lot of folks might leave their cats walking around in the backyard or see a cat and not even think of it as an invasive organism. But they could take out billions of birds each year in the United States, billions of small mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. And they're one of the leading causes of extinction of some critters out there. So, to give you an idea of the impact of invasive species, about one-third of the species on the endangered species list are impacted by endangered species. So, about 400 out of 1,300 species found on the endangered species list have negative interactions with invasives. And about 180 candidate species on the endangered species list are negatively impacted by invasive species. So a little bit more about that terminology. We talked about native, non-native is something that's outside its geographic area. To be non-native isn't always a bad thing. It's just once they become introduced to the environment and being established. So established is another great definition to learn. Is that self-reproducing population? Once like 2, 3, 4 of them become more, that's when it's really hard to control and can be starting to have those impacts that we have that cause that critter to become non-native to that invasive characteristic or that classification. And then nuisance. So I mentioned those critters that might have invasive kind of characteristics of maybe potentially hurting you or maybe causing you or the municipalities, cities, states, all sorts of stuff, economic harm. But if it's from here and it's it's sort of a disturbance, then it's just a nuisance. So think of maybe a pelican out of pier or an alligator in your backyard. Those aren't invasive, but those can be nuisances. So, what are some invasive species? It could be plants, like I mentioned, like the Brazilian pepper. It could be the mammals, like the feral hog over there. They cause about $1.5 billion in agricultural damage each year in the United States. It could be reptiles, amphibians, like the cane toad, the green iguana over there, lionfish, Muscovy ducks, birds. The European starling, like I mentioned, was actually intentionally released by Shakespeare fans. Muscovy ducks in the neighborhood potentially pooping on sidewalks that people have to clean up, or introducing more kind of nutrients in the environment that would otherwise be there from people feeding them, and sort of growing out of control. Or it could be stuff like funguses and bacteria, other kind of pathogens. Because that little bug right there, you might have not heard of it before, but you might have heard of that iguana. But this little bug called the Asian psyllid is actually, way more impactful economically compared to some of these critters that you see walking around today. That little bug that was introduced by a piece of citrus called a Buddha's hand uh, introduced the citrus greening disease that decreased Florida's uh, orange production by up to 74%, causing the state billions of dollars worth of agricultural damage and the loss of jobs. So, critters like that you might not even consider invasive have some of the larger ramifications to the economy, the environment, or people health. So how and why? This is a boring looking kind of slide, but I just wanted to keep it in here to sort of talk about the invasion process. So there's a lot of ways that things can fail the invasion process because they have to be from someplace else. So there's that barrier, that geographic barrier. They have to be brought over here. Somebody had to either think they were good to eat, they looked cool. Those are the two major kind of areas where invasive species come from, either agricultural or ornamental oftentimes. Somebody had to introduce it, so either intentionally or unintentionally, like a whoopsies, hurricane came, knocked over my tank, or, maybe intentional introduction like biocontrol or something like that, or, thinking a plant looks nice in an area or drying up the Everglades. These are all ways that things have been introduced. Then it has to be established, that self-sustaining reproducing population, and then spread. And there's a lot of ways that the invasion process can fail here. Somebody cannot bring it over, somebody cannot let it go. If they got let go, let's say you have one thing that does well in warm climates and you live up north. It's doing good in the summer, winter comes, now it's dead. Or the thing got let go and it might not have the right food source, the pollinators. It might not find a mate. It might not have those conditions to reproduce. So a lot of critters get introduced to the environment, and a lot of invasions fail. But it just takes those couple ones to really make that big environmental, economic, or human health impact. So in the United States, we have about 50,000 non-native species that were introduced. Most pose little to no threat, and about 98% of our food system, worth over $800 billion a year, is made up of non-native species. So some characteristics of invasive species. There's a lot more than this, but these are some common looking ones, or common ones that you might see with critters that you see. So it's not only, like I mentioned, animals. It could be plants. It could be pathogens. It could be a bunch of stuff like green-lipped mussels, zebra mussels. So a big one is fast growth rates. Oftentimes they might be able to outcompete the native species. Short time for reproduction. The ability to have lots of babies quicker, having lots of babies, or either being great parents. So there's some invasive fish out there that actually are good. They have good parental care, which gives their babies a head start, which allows them to outcompete some of our native ones here. They could be good at dispersing, covering a wide range of area, which allows them to find those ecological niches that they can fit in. They can be tolerant of many environments, whether that's living in brackish water, salt water, fresh water. Maybe it's hot or cold kind of climates. Maybe it's sandy soils versus swampy soils. Good at using resources. This is one in particular for reptiles, fish, and amphibians, because they have lower metabolic needs than a cat or a warm-blooded critter. So the ability to eat something and be satiated and healthy for a long time, like a python, makes that much more invasible, or whatever the term would be, likely to invade. And then cryptic coloration, whether it blends into the environment, allowing people to transport a little bit more. You might have seen the Cuban tree frogs hanging on the underside of leaves and stuff. Well, if you're not paying attention, you move that plant from one area to another. Now you're moving that frog as well. And then defenses and competition. So some invasive species like the cane toad might have that poison, the parotid, in their parotid glands right behind their head. That's more toxic than our native species of toads, or comes in at a greater quantity. The lionfish have those defenses, venomous spines, or other stuff like Brazilian peppers or Australian pines, creating something called allelopathy, which makes plants around it not grow as well. So just by having those critters or those plants in the environment, it's killing sort of the understory vegetation or competing with native species that grow there and push them out. So there's a lot of costs, there's the economic costs and the ecological costs. And oftentimes I mention this because money talks, and that the general public is usually the one that has to pay for maybe the introductions of a few kind of people. So, we want to spread the word of invasive species education so none of us are stuck with the bill, and we can help, preserve our ecosystems from being further impacted. Because in Florida, one of the largest economic drivers is our environment and tourism. So if people aren't coming to our state to visit the beaches, visit the swamps, seeing all this amazing biodiversity we have, that could be directly affecting, one of our biggest exports, which is tourism in our area. So economic cost, direct damages, to infrastructure. Oftentimes, this is done by maybe a pathogen or a plant or a disease that affects agriculture or land kind of stuff. Because it's really hard to have the price of like a raccoon or a bird or something like that. So a lot of these damages might be underreported in terms of invasive species impacts, in terms on the economy, because it's really hard to quantify it. But if I had a cornfield and had a bug introduced and wipe out the corn, then I can measure what I had before and after. Same thing with tree coverage, all sorts of stuff. There's costs with management. There's a lot of money going into research to prevent invasive species or how to battle them now. Then there is indirect costs and economic costs like loss of revenue. There's an example with a brown snake in Guam shorting out power lines, which cost the power company money to fix, but also those businesses weren't able to operate when the power was out. So that's sort of indirect costs. Then restoration efforts. We're putting in a lot of money to restore natural habitats, constantly, like this, which I believe is old world climbing fern causing that monospecies thicket, which isn't allowing our native pollinators to have the right host, isn't allowing our native animals to have the right food, and costs a lot of money to manage. So restoration efforts is a big thing. Ecological costs. Invasive species can prey on native species, like that lionfish eating a reef fish species right there. They have the potential to transmit disease, like that citrus greening with the Asian psyllid, or even the Burmese python is now known to introduce a lungworm or a parasite to our native species of snakes. They can compete for resources, they can compete for space, and or they could disturb the environment, causing processes and food web dynamics to not go as they did in the past. And then the indirect costs, like what's our cost of loss of biodiversity? When you see maybe dozens of species turn into handfuls of species, industries could rely on them, like commercially and recreationally viable uh, the species of fish, other kind of stuff relies on this diversity. So what's that cost us? And then here's just an area. Our most effective tool is prevention and eradication, early detection, rapid response. Once it's in the environment and reproducing, that established reproduction, established means self-reproducing population without the use of humans, it's really expensive to manage and control, and it gets almost impossible. There hasn't been a successful eradication of any established reptile, amphibian, or fish in the state of Florida as far as I'm concerned, or no. So non-natives in Florida, we like it here, and why do they? So why is Florida such a hotspot for non-natives and invasive species? You probably hear about it. You could probably find an invasive species title once a week in the newspaper in Florida. But we have plenty of tourism and trade hotspots. We have over 30 ports of entry that are huge, whether that's Port Everglades and Fort Lauderdale, Miami, Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville, bringing in a bunch of different kind of fruits, vegetables, perishable goods. That stuff can be hiding on the back end of it, or that little bug could just be burrowed inside. We have about 50 million visitors visiting our state every year, and that's counting. And that they're bringing in all their favorite foods. Like I mentioned, that Buddha hand having that Asian psyllid that introduced the citrus greening. They're bringing in their pets. They're bringing in a whole bunch of different things that could be potentially introduced to the environment. We have we have a tropical and subtropical environment with a lot of different ecological niches. You need fresh water, we got it. You need hot swamp, we got it. You want polar kind of swamp, we also have that. You want beach, we have that. So there's over 1,300 miles of shoreline in Florida. So think of like an ecological niche you could fit, and we could probably put an invasive species there, unfortunately. And then we have disturbed environments. So disturbed habitats are usually a place where invaders kind of colonize first because we already pushed out our native species. Whether that's something that compete with an invasive species, or maybe we took out the plant needed for our native species to thrive. So there's a lot of evidence out there that push towards a more natural state. Fixing these disturbed habitats maybe gives our native species a better chance and push some of these invaders away. We also have those hurricanes, which I mentioned can be the non-intentional introduction, knocking over a pet owner's cage and accidentally releasing a non-native, or even distributing different kind of seeds or something from plants just from the high winds and the water. To give you an idea, it's about a $500 million a year problem in the state of Florida, but about $50 million of that is almost just weed control. And I had a stat out there that said, I think from 2008 to 15, there was over $100 million just for aquatic weed control. And you might think, oh, that's a lot of money, and it definitely is. But if we don't take care of that, we're not having these navigable pathways, waterways where boats are having commerce and stuff. So it's a big problem here, and those figures that I mentioned are plants, which a lot of people might not even mention too much. They might be talking about the iguanas, the cane toads, but completely overlook a whole group of organisms that cause even a greater impact. And to tell you, we have about 16 native lizard species, 43 established non-natives, 46 native snakes, 4 established non-natives, 27 native frog species, 4 established non-natives. We have hundreds of non-native plants out here. We have over 150 to 200 non-native fish species that have been spotted. So it's really hard to determine if if they're established, having that reproductive population, or if it's just sightings here and there. But it could be both. One fish could be introduced to a pond and be established there, but maybe not in the overall ecosystem just yet. So we'll go into some cool species profiles of some invaders that you might have seen in the headlines, might have questions about, and want to help debunk that. Maybe talk about why these are invasive species, because they might have that label, but you might not think, how is this organism causing environmental, economic, or human harm? So the Burmese python, which is a big snake that can get up to 18 to 20 feet long and weigh up to 100 pounds, whereas introduced from Southeast Asia and first observed in 1979. So these snakes were actually pretty and they're cool. That's the sad thing about it, is like I do invasive species work because I also thought they were pretty and cool, and that's why I studied zoology and aquaculture and all these kind of things. So these things had to be interesting for somebody to bring it over and try to introduce it to the first place, or it had to be good to eat. Those are the two kind of factors. Ornamental or aquaculture or agriculture are ways that these things have really the pathway of coming over here. So they were imported heavily in the 1970s. I believe 17,000 snakes were imported from 70 to 95, and then another almost 100,000 snakes from 1996 to 2006. And ironically, in their native range, they're actually not doing so well because of the pet trade and because folks eat them there, and the skin trade. But over here, they're doing great, and they live in these tropical swamps. And where do we have a tropical swamp? The Florida Everglades. So they're just at home over there. They're active in the day or night depending on the season. During the daytime they might be more active in the winter when they need a sun. bask and maintain their body temperature, raise it a little bit. They might be more active at nighttime, um, uh, on roadways in the winter time, but they might sort of hide to seek thermal refuge during that time. So hit or miss on when you'll actually see them. They're really popular to seen cruising around at night over here in the Collier County area. They eat mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. They're ambush predators, so they don't really hunt. They don't really seek something. They just wait till something crosses them or gets near enough where they can detect it and attack it. They're semi-aquatic. They live in the marshes and swamps. They could reproduce. They reproduce using eggs. So pythons use eggs. Fun fact: if you are familiar with boas, which are the New World's kind of version of pythons. Pythons are from Africa and Asia. Boas are from South America and Central America. Boas actually give live birth while pythons lay eggs. So, fun fact there. They could live 15 to 25 years in captivity. And yeah, so they could eat up to 76, I believe, different species in our area. So that's very impactful on their ecology and our environment. They could potentially attack a person, but I don't believe there's been any known attacks. 99% of the time, if you leave a snake alone, the snake will leave you alone. So any kind of bites from these critters would probably be somebody actually interacting with it. So you're safe there. And then in terms of economic harm, there's a lot of research out there for these snakes causing a lot of money, a lot of managers out there trying to catch them, as well as restoration efforts. So we spent a lot of money restoring the habitat for the wood stork and the key largo wood rat, probably tens of millions of dollars to restore those habitats. And those are food items for the Burmese pythons. So that's a almost indirect kind of cost that these snakes have on our economy as well. So everybody's seen these lionfish. A lot of people don't know that there's actually a lot of different species of lionfish. There's about 500 species in the Scorpionidae family, but within lionfish as a whole, there's three genuses. There's the Pterois, spelt with a P, like pterodactyl. There's Pteropterois and Dendrochirus. And this these lionfish are here from the Indo-Pacific area. There's some species I believe that you can find like the Indian Ocean and around Africa. First observed in 1985, so a lot of folks, thought that these were introduced by Hurricane Andrew, but 1985 is before Hurricane Andrew. Hurricane Andrew could have definitely increased the number of individuals out there in the wild, which would have helped the genetics of the lionfish to prevent inbreeding, make them a little bit more robust. But they were here before that big storm that a lot of people blame for them. They're introduced by the aquarium trade because I don't know about you, but they look pretty. They have cool characteristics. They have really neat ornamentation. They're personable, but unfortunately, they're venomous. So they're a little bit harder to eat than some of our native kind of fish that we have out there. But our native species like red grouper, Goliath grouper, barracuda, shark, amberjack have been known to eat lionfish. The size about them is about 18 inches is like a really big one. 3 pounds is a big one. They eat fish and invertebrates. They corral these critters into corners using their big fins, which actually translate to winged. So Pterois, like pterodactyl, is like winged. So they use their winged pectoral fins to corral whatever they want to eat directly into the center of their mouth. So they live on reefs, live bottoms, and depths of over 1,000 feet. They can live in temperatures up to 50 degrees, so that's really cold, and salinities as low as 4 parts per thousand. So typical saltwater salinity is about 30 parts per thousand, 30 to 35. So these can live way low below regular salinity conditions. Not to say that they'll thrive there, but that factor allows them to be maybe transported to new areas that could help bolster their populations other areas. They can live. They lay 15 to 30,000 eggs in two gelatinous mattices. Males become reproductive at about 4 inches, females at about 7 inches, and that could be done within their first year. And in some areas, they can spawn almost weekly, just depending on the temperature. So that's not to say they're doing that in like the Carolinas or Georgia or anything, but in warm water climates, when they're well conditioned, they could be, producing a lot of eggs. But yeah, in terms of they're sort of the poster boy for an invasive species, because remember, it has to cause damage to the economy, humans, or the environment. So the economy, definitely taking out fish species that are valuable for commercial industries and recreational industries. So fishing in Florida is worth $13 billion a year. So these things could definitely be eating our small grouper snapper. Environmental damage, definitely eating pretty much most things that can fit in its mouth. So that includes reef grazing species. So that maybe it's a small fish that picks the algae off of rocks, or a small invertebrate that does that. Well, coral needs surface area to grow. So if algae is on those rocks, the coral can't grow. So that's impacting our environment there if you don't consider all the other species it can eat. And then human harm, they're venomous. So, what kind of more impactful thing than potentially, causing pain to somebody? They have 18 venomous spines that are located on the dorsal fin, the anal fin, and then the pelvic fin. They're pectoral fins that you can sort of use your arm as. Don't have venomous spines at all. But yeah, like I said, poster child for invasives, inva- uh, damage to the environment, damage to humans, and damage to the economy. So this is public enemy number one in our area, the cane toads. I get a lot of calls about these. They were introduced to the United States in our area as a form of potential biocontrol for the sugarcane beetle. These guys are from southern Texas and the Amazon basin. Um, they were introduced in the 30s to take care of that beetle. But how tall is sugarcane? Sugarcane's like really tall. How tall is a toad? A toad's like 3 or 4 inches tall. So it'd take a lot of toads to like crawl up and make like a little ladder to get to the top to eat that one bug. So they sort of missed the step there, and maybe they could eat one stage of the life cycle of that sugarcane beetle, but not all of them. So they're not a form of biological control there. But they didn't think they were introduced by that biocontrol thing in the 30s and the 50s. They thought that they were introduced by the pet trade later on. They get about 6 to 9 inches long. Any toad over 4 inches in our state is a cane toad. Our native species of toads don't get that large. So if you see a toad that's as big as your hand, chances are it's a cane toad. Interestingly enough, young are active during the day. Adults are mostly active at night, and they believe that this is because uh, their vision's not that great. They're eating anything that sort of hops in front of them. A little cane toad can look like a little bug. So if that hops in front of a mommy, he doesn't know that if it's its species or not. So cannibalism is a thing that they've observed in this, and maybe those different kind of daytime usage uh, is a trait that was picked up by the juvenile toads to make them grow up and not be eaten by their cousins, their brothers, their sisters, their moms and dads. They eat insects, small animals, and vegetation. They're omnivorous. They hunt. They scavenge. Oftentimes, you see them at like a street light that they look like they're at a bar. That street light is in a residential neighborhood, and bugs are flying into it and falling down, and the cane toads are eating all the ones that are falling down. So yeah, that's where you see them mostly in these urban areas. If you go out in the middle of the Everglades or these really sort of natural areas, it might be really hard to find a cane toad. But if you're in a residential neighborhood, we pushed out all our native critters. We created perfect environments for them where there's no predators, no competition, shallow bodies of water with streetlights all over. So that's a perfect environment for a cane toad. And they can lay 8 to 30,000 eggs per year per clutch. And they can lay multiple clutches per year just depending on that female's condition and the temperature. They could get about 10 to 15 years in age. And yeah, really, if you see cane toads in your area, the best thing is to prevent your house from becoming sort of a cane toad haven, because we're never going to eradicate these completely, but we can make your house less cane toad friendly. Trimming your bushes up a little taller, installing bug lights, removing standing bodies of water, removing pet food from outside are all good steps to limit the amount of these toads around your area. But another thing is our native species of animals evolved with the southern toad. and I believe 3 other species in the Buffonidae family. So they're used to that poison that is in this family of toads. But our dogs and cats haven't. So a black racer, a native bird, they can eat a cane toad potentially and be not as impacted, but our dogs and cats aren't. So in terms of an environmental kind of threat, less so on the environmental side, more so on the human damage side, where folks aren't they're not welcome around people's houses oftentimes. They might be concerned with their dogs and their cats. But like I mentioned, in very natural areas in Florida, it might be hard to find a cane toad, and so more of that human kind of harm, less of the environmental kind of harm. But they are a big problem here. One way to distinguish them between our native southern toad, which is the species that is most confused about with them, is that these native southern toads are going to be smaller, under 4 inches or under, yeah, 4 inches. They have these neural crests between the eyes that's absent in the cane toad. The cane toad also has this really large triangular gland here, while these are smaller and oval. And you want to make sure the toad's at least 2 inches before you decide, whether you're going to um, uh, humanely euthanize them, remove them from the environment, uh, uh, because we don't want to have a mistaken identity. So make sure you're good with your toad identification before you do any of that. So another species that a lot of people see around, but they don't really know too much about, are tilapia. So tilapia is sort of a generic term for a cichlid from Africa and the Middle East. There's over 1,300 species of cichlids, so they're not all cichlids. There's definitely plenty of African cichlids out there that are not tilapia. But in Florida, we have 6 species of tilapia that are established or potentially established. We have ones like the black chin tilapia here, which is a very euryhaline. Euryhaline means it can handle wide ranges of salinities, right? Haline is salt, haline, and then uri is sort of a wide range. So these guys can live in like pretty much full strength seawater and above that. I see them around the mangrove ecosystems in our area oftentimes. We have the spotted tilapia. We have I believe this might be, I can't remember this one. We have the blue tilapia, the Nile tilapia, the Mozambique tilapia, the hornet tilapia, and then the red belly tilapia. So they're first observed in 1961. The blue tilapia was. That's a species that's not so much, ornamentation like you imagine these Mozambique and some of the hornets, but they can get up to 8-10 pounds easy, and so that's a food fish. Tilapia is actually a really great fish for developing countries because instead of being protein deficient, you can dig a hole and grow these fish. And unfortunately, that's how easy it is, and that's why they're pretty plentiful in our area. So they're introduced by the aquaculture or pet trade, just depending on which species of tilapia we're talking about. Some of them are pretty, some of them are more food fish. And then they eat algae, detritus, plants, plankton, and small organisms. And why would that be sort of an issue? We want algae gone out of our environment a lot of times. Well, because a lot of times they might be rooting. So that rooting kind of behavior, like you see hogs do, they're just sort of digging into the ground, filter feeding whatever they can eat out. Maybe causing disturbances in the bottom soil, the plant communities down there. Could be suspending solids that are decreasing the light from penetrating, causing the native species of plants to die. They eat low in the food chain, so there's plenty of food out there for them, and they usually overrun areas. If you go to springs, you'll see plenty of tilapia. Blue Springs area, there's plenty of tilapia there. So they're competing with food sources, food web dynamics. Maybe if there's a nesting bass, a nesting native species of critter, they could be disturbing them from doing that. And then one thing about these are a lot of these non-native species of fish. A lot of them might be cichlids. Oftentimes are great parents. So fish have lots of babies, but if you give your baby a head start, um, that usually is a, a criteria for success. So interestingly enough, some species of tilapia are mouth brooders, where the safest place to be if you're an animal, is probably around your parents. But some of these juvenile fish fry will actually run into the parent's mouth for safety. So that's sort of a cool characteristic. Or they might be substrate spawners that instead of dispersing eggs into the water column, they're guarding their eggs, which allow them to have better hatch rates, better chance of them becoming established. A lot of people might see these guys, the sailfin catfish. There's a couple of genuses of them, but there's three big species that we see in Florida. There is the vermiculated, the Amazon, and the Orinoco. They all look very similar from the top, but the bottom of them tells a story. So the vermiculated looks like this little Rorschach test, and that's the most common. The Amazon has the dots, and the Orinoco is sort of a mix between them. So they're first from their native range is the Amazon basin. They were observed in the 50s, 90s, and the 80s, introduced by the pet trade. A lot of people have these as they know them as suckerfish, cleaning up the algae in their tanks, but they don't know that these fish get 20 inches plus long. So we call that the tank buster effect, and that might be one criteria for fish to become established and introduced to the environment to begin with. Your tank might not have the size for a fish this big for its whole life, and folks might dump it into the environment, which is something we shouldn't do. Same thing with some of those tilapia species. Maybe it gets too big, or maybe you have a fish that picks on the other fish, and you don't want to kill it, so you release it in the environment, causing more potential damage for your area. But these guys eat detritus, algae, bivalves. You might say, why is that bad again? Because they're eating algae and we don't want algae. Well, just by that rooting behavior causing that sediment to get suspended, they are burrowers, so they're great parents too. They lay about 2,000 adhesive eggs in burrows from April through September, and they'll dig out those shorelines. And if those shorelines are dug out, they could collapse, and it costs managers plenty of money to correct those shorelines. And for those ponds, the retention ponds, canals, all sorts of stuff to function properly. So that's one of the invasive characteristics there. We'll go a little bit quicker because we got a couple more of these. Cuban tree frogs, first observed in Florida in 1920s. They believe they were introduced by cargo because these guys are really great at hiding. So we've seen some plant nurseries in South Florida, potentially introducing some frogs up to the panhandle by, them sort of hiding on the underside of leaves, lips, packing materials, all sorts of stuff. They get up to 1 to 6 inches. They're larger than most of our native species of tree frogs, so they can prey upon them, as you can see there. More common in urban than natural kind of areas because we've pushed out our native species. But they're mildly toxic. Nothing that would send anybody to the doctors per se, unless you really are ingesting it or rubbing your eyes pretty good. But sort of minimal in terms of the environmental kind of damage, more of a human kind of nuisance kind of damage, and potentially some economic damage by, shorting out some electrical boxes if you find one somewhere, which oftentimes people find them in air-conditioned units and all sorts of stuff. But then we have the brown anole. So brown anole native range is Cuba, Bahamas, and the Caribbean. First observed in 1887, introduced by cargo. So these guys could hide anywhere. They're about 5 to 9 inches long, 48 grams. Active during the daytime. They're insectivorous. So they're eating spiders, invertebrates, insects, all sorts of stuff. Even our native green anoles, I've seen some cannibalistic cannibalism across species, and then even internal species with large brown anoles eating small brown anoles, newly hatched ones. So why is that a problem? Well, you see these way more often than our native species of green anoles, so it's altering those food web dynamics. And like I mentioned, everything has like a scale. There's good and bad, but then there's that gray spot in between, and that's where a lot of these might fit. Where what's the damage of eating insects have on our economy, our environment, or human health? But we want to restore stuff to its native state and have our native critters here. So these aren't as impactful as, let's say, like cats or maybe even possibly iguanas, but we want to have our natural ecosystems. And they live in low ground vegetation more so than up in the trees, and they could lay 1 to 2 eggs every 7 to 14 days in warm months. And I mentioned that up in the trees thing because a UF study looking at brown anoles and green anoles in the Gainesville area saw that green anoles were present in some brown anoles locations, but were located higher up in trees. So, you might see these species kind of shifts internally as we see interactions between a non-native and a native species uh, happen for a longer period of time, and we have better data to record that. Green iguanas, everybody has seen them if you went to South Florida. First observed in 1964 by the pet trade, get about 5 feet long, 17 pounds, eat vegetation, eggs, insects, and vertebrates. They're omnivorous, but as they grow older, a lot of these kind of things will switch more towards veggies because they're not making more body mass. They're having a more kind of maintenance diet. Um, and they live in ground on the ground trees, suburban and urban and agricultural areas. They could definitely create a little bit of agricultural damage and environmental damage. They eat vegetation mostly. They could eat eggs, which is a bad thing, but our native species can also do that. Their big thing that was quoted a lot by FWC is damage to infrastructure. I believe they shorted out some power lines, causing some folks to go to the hospital that, might have needed ventilators or like temperature control equipment. Air conditioning is a really big thing, especially for the elderly community. Um, and I believe they caused damage to a dam, which our native species could do too. But when you see a overwhelming majority of a certain kind of organism in a location, and if you go down to the Keys, you'll see hundreds of these. That's ecologically not a good thing. So what's happening now? There's an increased awareness of the issue. You guys are hearing me talk. You're sure to tell your friends about it, that you learned something. I'm here as a resource if you have any questions in the future that I can help you with. There's changes in legislation and condition requirements. So folks, there's different conditions on owning certain kinds of snakes. There's conditional species now. Um, there's preventative measures from stuff happening. There's actually laws out there for even different municipalities or HOAs of what kind of plants you're allowed or not allowed to have. Because oftentimes, a department store or hardware store might not know those, and they have a buyer that'll carry a plant that might be prohibited in our area. So it's up to us to make sure we can check, if this is something that would be good in our area or potentially invasive. There's a lot of restoration efforts out there. We're trying to restore our natural habitats, potentially bring in our native critters, our native plants to, combat some of these invasive species potentially. There's research out there. There's more detection methods. They're, doing radio tracking. They're doing acoustic tagging. There's environmental DNA where you can see if a species is present in a water sample. There's sentinels, there's dogs, there's biocontrol. Biocontrol is being really popular now with a lot of uh, bugs that are used to sort of disturb our invasive plants, to not necessarily kill them, but to prevent them from wanting to reproduce. So there might be things like thrips that can attack a Brazilian pepper and not necessarily kill the Brazilian pepper, but prevent it from making the seeds, which is how it spreads. Or maybe that one stressor of the thrips might be a way for a cold front to come and knock it out more readily. So what can you do? You can get involved. You can participate in your local SISMAs. SISMA stands for Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. We have different kind of events like roundups or weed wrangles. Report sightings of non-native species using the I've Got One app or EdMaps, because that's the second most effective tool that we have compared to prevention, is that early detection, rapid response, sending folks over there to prevent the spread of it from happening. volunteer with FWC. You can attend trainings and roundups. I think there's like python removal trainings and stuff nowadays. You could do responsible pet ownership, not only for you, but for others. You know, if you see somebody buying rock python or something, which I think are prohibited now, make sure they know how long and how long it can live and how big it could get. But you know, species like red-tailed boas, I don't think are prohibited yet. Those can get 10 feet long. They're sold as this oftentimes. So make sure if your friends considering it, be like, hey, you might have to eat rabbits as it gets older. So are you ready to, you know, care for it for its whole life? If you can't, there's FWC Pet Amnesty Days. You can relinquish your non-native pets to FWC, and they'll find homes for them. So look that up if you have a turtle that you're thinking about letting go. You know, look for the next Exotic Pet Amnesty Day. You can self-remove these invasive species. You could think natural, you know, increasing Florida-friendly landscaping, more native pollinators, more opportunities for our native organisms. Um, you can modify your house to prevent them from, you know, wanting to be around your house, and educate yourself and others. So takeaway, pretty much the new normal. Like I mentioned, there once an animal is established, that self-reproducing population without human aid, it's usually here to stay, unfortunately. So there's emerging industries and events like lionfish roundups you might have seen. And this is one of my favorite pictures here. It says buy local, whole caught wild whole caught wild lionfish. So these are an Indo-Pacific species, but it says buy local. This is in Florida. So we're sort of living with them, and you can see that now with lionfish, iguanas, all sorts of stuff. You know, there's python roundups, and like I mentioned, not just reptiles, amphibians, fish, cats can be invasive. There's, you know, diseases out there. There's mammals. There's birds. There's all sorts of stuff. So, you know, don't put the onus on scaly critters. It could be a bunch of stuff. And it's not the animals or plants' fault that, you know, they're invasive. They're just doing what they normally do outside their geographic range. So, you know, remove them with care and support research. And it's up to everyone to make a difference. So here's my information. If you have any questions, I would appreciate, folks, if you guys could scan the QR code or take the survey that will be linked in some sort of registration kind of email. But there, you can scan that with your phone and take it now. It's only like 10 questions, 5 minutes to do. Helps me out. You can email me if you have any more questions. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Mike, wow, that that was amazing. I have questions myself that I wrote down. I was very surprised about some things, as well as there's some questions that came in too as well. But you did a great job of explaining stuff. So I'm gonna get to my questions last because I have some comments too as well. So let me go look at the questions that have come in, and we'll keep going with that one. Let's see. Okay. So one question is, how do we know when we're able to, as you were saying with the cane frog growth, sorry, the cane frog was to be able to humanely, was it euthanize them, right? How do we know what species is and what species not?
That's a great question. So, like I mentioned, any toad over 4 inches will be a cane toad. The cane toads are easy to distinguish from our native species of toad once they're over 2 inches. Because the cane toad, I could actually probably go back on that slide just to have a cool, a quick little picture.
Let's jump back over there.
The cane toad actually has, they're lacking those neural crests over here that you see between the eyes of our native southern toad. And then these cane toads have these really large triangular parotoid glands or parotid glands compared to these oval ones. So any species of toad that's over 2 inches, you'll have a really good understanding, and we recommend not removing them unless they're over 2 inches, because they can get confused with our native southern, our native oak, our native fowlers, and spadefoot toads, but those look a little bit different. So if you Google cane toad in UF, there's a lot of information out there on them. And if you Google like COVID cane toad removal, I think I wrote a blog about it that has a link to all the EDIS fact sheets and the three uh, videos that Dr. Steve Johnson created.
Awesome, Mike. Thank you. The
Mhm.
next question we have is on the iguana, why do they have spikes? Someone like to know why
Uh,
do they have spikes?
so those spikes aren't really that spiky. That's the funny thing about it. Those spikes are more so like ornamentation. Like if you touch them, they're not. You could like break them if you wanted to. There's some like spiny-tailed iguanas, but it's not really for defense. More so, it's what they look like.
Hmm. Gotcha. So another question is, do brown anoles eat venomous spiders too?
They could, but so can our native species of anoles too, the green anole, and so that's sort of the hard thing to talk about a little bit. Like, yeah, that's a good thing, but we sort of need all our species of spiders too. We don't want the venomous ones to be around, but yeah, they could eat that. Interestingly enough, I saw something that like brown anoles were less likely to be like a carrier of malaria than green anoles were. So it's like
Wow.
there's a positive aspect too, but malaria is really rare in the United States. There's a lot of mosquito control districts, but you could play devil's advocate with a lot of these kind of critters. Like I had an invasive species symposium recently, and the feral hog is terrible. The feral hog, it causes $1.5 billion of agricultural damage. I think there's a million or more estimated in Florida, and potentially tens of millions in the United States, right? But they were talking about how the feral hog is also a food source for the Florida panther. That's an invasive species, or that's an endangered species.
Mhm.
So we have that sliding scale of like, hey, we don't have any critters for these panthers to eat. There's this hog, but the hog causes plenty of agricultural damage, can carry diseases like pseudo rabies or brucellosis, and yeah, it causes plenty of economic and environmental damage.
Yep, I know about hogs pretty good. We actually see them
Mhm.
sometimes early in the morning and they're on the edge of the road rooting up, especially when it's rained some and that mud
Mhm.
and that that runoff just right. And you'll see them in there rooting up and digging up stuff. So yeah, I've seen them
Yeah,
too there as well.
they don't have functional sweat glands, so that's why they like to be crepuscular, active in the
Makes sense.
daytime and active in the early morning and sort of later on at night.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So our next question is there a resource that lists the invasive species that can be euthanized as far as what is legal and illegal?
That's a great question too. So there are some things, I actually have it written down somewhere, that there's special permissions for some invasive species, like lionfish. I believe you're allowed to harvest lionfish in areas that it might be a marine protected area, or it might be closed for fishing. But those regulations can vary so much that, before you do so, I would definitely recommend looking up that certain marine protected area or that area that you're going to that you can harvest lionfish. If it's open for regular fishing, you can completely remove lionfish. They make it a little easier for people to sell them to as like an
Hmm.
economic driver and incentive to remove them by allowing only a SPL, a saltwater products license, to be required to sell them, compared to some reef fish species that it might be tens of thousands of dollars for the proper permitting to sell them.
Okay.
Lionfish, they made it a little bit easier there. There's also executive orders out there that allow like removal of invasive reptiles on some state-owned lands that you're not allowed to hunt on. I can't remember the exact order. Oh, it might be. It might be Order 50 CAFR 21 by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Look that up, but there are legislation that promotes removal of invasive species in areas or conditions where it might not be the same for a native species.
That makes sense. I've noticed as well, like with lionfish, of course, me and you fish a lot. We go to FWC to look for those regulations, right? You see lionfish in
Mhm.
there as well. It seems, is FWC the place that individuals should look to see those regulations, to see what they have out there as far as on the invasive species, the non-invasive species
Yeah,
list, I think. Yeah,
yeah,
invasive
that
species list.
that would be the best. They sort of control wildlife. The FDAX is more so what was it called? Or the Florida Department of Agricultural and Consumer Sciences, they do plants, produce, and like bugs. FWC would do more so your invasive critters, whether that's a reptile, amphibian, mammal, or a fish. So they have all their legislation out there, especially stuff that you're even allowed to have or not allowed to have. Some of this stuff, like I mentioned, it's definitely in the public eye. You see, I think my first slide here is talking about new conditions for banning some species. And that's something that's could be good and bad at the same time because a lot of these industries might rely on non-native species, and non-native species are all right until they're introduced into the environment. So you can see here that there are constantly new rules that are getting changed, uh, making some stuff from conditional to prohibited completely. Like now, if you were to catch a Burmese python or a iguana, you're not even allowed to have it in your possession alive, um, which folks might want to keep it for a pet, or they might export it to another state to sell where they might not even live if they got out in the environment, but they're not allowed to do so just by this regulation out there. So, if you have to think about it, you probably should look it up.
That makes it.
Mhm. Sure, sure. Oh, oops. I just keep on clicking away. But oh man, that's a hard one. Oh, jeez. Uh, man, I have so many. I I I'm a big fish tank nerd, so I like corals. I like growing and propagating corals, so that's a cool one, like zoanthid corals. I like invertebrates a lot. So there's shrimp. I like these things called neocardinia or cherry shrimp that you might have saw.
Hmm.
They're all sorts of different colors, and you'll see them on social media. Man, that's so hard. I would have to say fish tank stuff, corals.
So coral's more your favorite, or your favorite
Oh yeah, there's
animal.
so many varieties. They're pretty. Then there's reef building kinds and stuff too. It's pretty mesmerizing when you see like the patterns and the shapes that they create, whether it's a big brain bouldering coral or some sort of star coral out there. So I'm a coral freak.
That's really cool. I Here's a quick story. I was snorkeling down at Pigeon Key,
Mhm.
and we found some conch, and they were in the shell. And I was pointing, and we were recording on a GoPro. So as I point down to my wife to tell her, "Hey, there's a conch, lift it up, see if it's in there." I put my hand on a brain coral and pushed it. it
Hmm.
was the weirdest feeling thing. It was, it like freaked me out. So my wife was laughing because she was like, "You're running out of the water like one of those lizards that run across the water." It's a real weird feeling. So
Oh yeah.
that's my first encounter with brain coral. I didn't know it was
Oh
that
yeah.
soft. I thought it was
Well,
like a
yeah,
big weird fish.
we don't want to touch them too much, but one thing that's interesting about coral is they're cnidarians. So cnidarians belong to like jellyfish, sea anemones, all sorts of stuff. And a lot of people associate jellyfish with stinging, or anemones as not stinging a clownfish. Well, corals sort of have that same kind of characteristic as well. Folks like might touch like fire coral and get stung, but even a coral that might be squishy could be sending out those pneumatocysts, like those little stinging barbs out there. But our skin on our hand is very, thick, and they can't
Hmm.
get penetrate that. But if you were to, touch that brain coral maybe with a cut on your finger or something like that, that illuminates that barrier for entry. And I've touched some coral in my tank with a cut on my finger, and it hurt. So they definitely are, still related to their cousins that have those shooting pneumatocysst spears like the jellies and the anemones.
That's really good to
Just a
know.
little
Didn't know
prettier.
that. Didn't know that
Yeah.
about coral. So I'll make sure even more not to touch them with my foot or anything like that when I'm around them.
Yep.
um, let's see. I'm just trying to see which one I should ask because you were touching one thing you touched on was when it comes to building, right? New construction, knocking trees down, replacing an area, making it new, right? You were talking
Hmm.
about how a residential area is really good for cane toads, right?
Hmm.
Here in our area, we have a lot of building going on, but it seems like that's everywhere in the United States. I remember
Yeah.
is a certain area. I was like, I'm worried if they knock the trees down here, they're gonna release a whole bunch of animals that I don't think they want to deal with, right? And
Hmm.
literally, when they knocked this huge area down, I think over 5 miles, right, long, but I don't know how much it is wide. It's close to the St. Johns River. The monkeys came out. And so
Oh
we
man.
know, yeah, so there's monkey down around the springs. We're not going to say what springs that is. You can go look it up if you want on what is it, on the national, I'm sorry, Florida State Parks. You can find out where they are. And
Mhm.
we had a little issue with them for a while. So going into and bringing that up, the question was, and you touched on it some,
Mhm.
I think you said we won't really be able to, I wouldn't say eradicate, right? We don't do that. So lower the amount of invasive species, right? Is it more of a thing that you feel that we just have to coexist with them? Because I see like with the pythons, you say people were eating them, and I was like, what? So do we need to eat more pythons to make it go down? But that's silly to think about. But what do you think? Do you think it's more of we just have to coexist?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of unfortunately the way it is. I asked an entomologist one time about what should do about cockroaches and like rain kind of events because they might live
Mm-hmm.
around your mulch and then it
Mm-hmm.
rains and they all sort of move. And he told me to change my perception. So unfortunately, a lot of these, like I mentioned, once they become established, which is that self-sustaining reproducing population without the use of humans, right? So if you don't have to
Mm-hmm.
like cross-pollinate or be like, hey, one frog, come next to this frog, they're almost here to stay. So the only way we could
Makes
really
sense.
control that is unfortunately there's a lot of theories out there. I'm not the authority on this completely, but it would probably be with something like biological control, which is scary for a lot of folks because a lot of folks might be like, "That's how they got here to begin with." Whether it's that cane toad introduction to take care of that sugarcane beetle, or mongooses that got introduced to Hawaii to take care of like rats and stuff like that. Because like those are failed sort of forms of biological control, but all those were happening in like the early 1900s, before computers, before sharing information, before people even cared about invasive species a lot of times. But now with like research out there, there's research on like stuff like making mosquitoes sterile. and making male mosquitoes sterile, and they will breed with the females and create infertile offspring. So
Mm,
that would be a way that we could probably get a better handle on the problem, because we might be removing pythons, but I'm going to sleep at like 2 a.m., 3 a.m. Those pythons are still out there moving around. They could be miles
mhm.
in the middle of the swamp. So unless we have a predator out there for them, which we don't even want anything bigger than a python out there, but ways that we can maybe manipulate the genetics of some, maybe potentially introduce, I don't know, a pest to a python or something. That would be the only way to really get some sort of control on them. I don't know if it's possible with most species, but some species, like I mentioned, the Brazilian pepper, having these thrips that can stress the plant, not completely kill it, but gives us the ability to manage it a little bit more. They're doing the same thing with like weevils and air potatoes,
Mm.
and that kind of research is still to be done and developing and exciting, because we have all these great technologies out there that help us make it possible.
Definitely. And just ending on this, I was just super surprised how long they've been here. Some like the python, I was thinking, oh, maybe they just came in the 90s or something like that. Um,
Mhm.
it's very surprised that they've been here a long time, even before I was born. Maybe you were born too, right? We're around the same age, but that's crazy. So when I see all these efforts with this state, I'm thinking that, oh, that's 10 to 12 years, 15 years. No, that's been a lot of years that these animals have been here. So Mike, again, man, this is have been awesome information. I know we're gonna send some emails out with some more information, some more resources that you have given out.
Mhm.
If you, oh yeah, this webinar will be on demand again, so you can always go back and watch it. Again, it's on Facebook. It's actually on YouTube as well that we're streaming, and it'll be on our website that you can go back and get those resources too as well. I want to thank our sponsors as well as our partners for being able to throw on this webinar. I also want to tell you, if you want to know more about Soul Margin Fishing and Conservation Foundation, you can follow us on Instagram as well as Facebook. And if you want to know how can you get involved with events that we're doing, whether it's cleanups or we're having webinars, or just want to look at our website to see how you can find gear or apparel, go to soulmarginfishing.org, right? Go down to the bottom and there's a place called newsletter. Put your information in there and we send newsletter out. So you can come and hang with us. We love having a good time. It's always like a family with us. And we just have a good time learning and doing education and really affecting and doing good things to our area, right? So one thing we have going on this Saturday, starting at 9 o'clock, ending at 12, is our last education series as well as cleanup and tournament day for the Big Sam Slam tournament. So you want to come visit, you can do that, and we would love to have you there. So other than that, that is it. This is Captain Sam. I'm logging off, and I'll catch you guys on the other side of the tide. Good night, guys.